Priscilla Barrera with the Investing News Network. And here with me today is Andrew Miller, who's Production Director at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Priscilla.
All right, and I wanted to start by asking you, obviously, about battery metals and prices for battery metals. We've seen prices turn to the upside in the past few months. Do you expect that to continue? And in particular, did the performance of any of the battery metals surprise you?
Yes, I think we've definitely seen a more active start to the year this year when it comes to battery raw material pricing. You know, you look particularly at what's happening in cobalt, lithium, especially, and you're really starting to see, you know, the turnaround in these markets from a price perspective, but more importantly, the demand fundamentals that we've been talking about for so long now start to come to fruition. And I would emphasize start, because we're still very much at the beginning of this growth curve, which is really going to accelerate throughout the decade. So it's really positive to see those prices turn around. I think, you know, one thing we're certainly looking at is that there is a little bit of flexible capacity in some of these markets, which I think is going to, you know, if not stabilize prices, maybe slow down the increases going into sort of Q3. But at what we're expecting come the end of the year, and I think, you know, you really have to look at those contracting periods throughout the year that are going to be really pivotal in the direction of pricing, because I think, you know, in our models, particularly when you look at the likes of lithium, and then that's one area that sort of maybe happened a little bit quicker than we'd expected, to your point about, you know, where things have happened that we haven't quite expected. You know, lithium's definitely continued its ride. When you see what's happening in China, it's happening very fast. But I think when you get towards the end of the year and you start to see some of those volumes for 2021 be placed, I think it's going to expose that actually that flexible capacity in the market isn't going to be able to absorb all of that new demand. And when you come into this growth period where year on year the volumes are getting significantly bigger in terms of orders from the battery industry, I think that's has the potential to create a real bottleneck in terms of keeping supply up with demand.
All right. So would you expect this price spike to see more projects come online or incentivize expansions that were stopped last year? And I just wanted to ask you if you actually think there's a possibility of ending up in a similar situation to what happened back in 2018, and what lessons could we learn from that period?
Yeah, so I definitely think, and you know, the positive thing, again, at the start of the year with prices going up, we are starting to see capital go into some of these new expansions, whether it be the incumbents accelerating some of their previously laid plans, or whether it be newcomers to the space, you know, attracting capital and able to push forward the development of new projects. So that's been a real positive to come out of this, because obviously over the past couple of years, we've talked a lot about how the low price environment isn't really attracting capital at the speed that's going to be needed for that future growth. So that definitely is a positive to start seeing money come back into the sector. I still think there's a long way to go. And I think, you know, to your point about whether this is, you know, the sort of 2015, 2016 spike, and then things sort of came back and there was a correction 2018 onwards. I think the chances of that are a lot more limited this time around, just because of how steep the demand curve is over the coming years. And, you know, what you saw and what ultimately saw that correction in prices around 2018 was the fact that demand wasn't quite at the point of growing as fast as many people had thought. So the ability to bring on, you know, again, in the case of lithium, to bring on 4 or 5 new spodumene operations swung the balance in the other direction. At the moment, you know, you need those new producers to get up to full capacity, which they haven't really done to date. Plus, you need the introduction of you're talking 1-2 mines every single year from here on out. So that's a pretty steep ask for an industry that hasn't, you know, had the best, you know, across a lot of these battery raw materials, they haven't had the best track record of delivering on some of those expansions.
All right, and I'm just going to move from prices to more of macro trends. We've seen regions like Europe, North America, even Australia, they're pushing forward with plans to build this ecosystem, supply chains, or how you call it, lithium-ion economies. What trends do you expect to see in terms of securing supply of raw materials in those regions?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more to happen on that front in terms of, you know, building out the supply chains. We're really still, the early stages of a lot of these areas of the world developing, just that one step up the supply chain in terms of having some battery production. And you see huge, obviously hit the headlines around what Tesla's doing or LG or SK are doing in Europe, in the US, and, expanding, diversifying where that battery production takes place. There still is, for a lot of those regions, though, the added question of, where's the supply chain going to come from to support that type of battery growth? And we certainly expect there to be more battery demand growth from the emergence of new mega factories over the coming years. So that stage in the supply chain isn't going to slow down. You're certainly seeing, another thing to come out of the past sort of 12, 18 months has been the diversification of that demand. So it's not just a China story anymore. The EV sales numbers, when you look at what's happening in Europe, look at what's happening in North America, that tells you the story of where this growth is going. And that building out the steps preceding your battery cells and looking all the way back to the mine, there still needs to be a lot done on that front. And I think, when we speak to, whether it be OEMs, whether it be the battery companies themselves, that there is this additional uncertainty and question mark over, where is the material going to come from? Because the economics of some of these facilities rely on you having some element of, access to raw materials, number one, but a sustainable source of those raw materials to develop those assets over time. So a lot more to be done. I think you're going to see a lot more in terms of partnerships. We've already started to see a few of those emerge, partnerships along the supply chain, or in some cases, integration along that supply chain, which will make sense for some companies. But a lot more activity, I think, is definitely to come over the next few years on that front.
All right, and let's just talk about North America for a moment. We have a new administration in the US. We've seen Canada take more of a green approach, and we continue to see these reports on the way countries should move forward in terms of clean energy, from stockpiling to stop investing in oil and gas. I just wanted to ask you, what role do you think legislation will play in the build out of these lithium-ion economies? And can the sector rely just on that? And what other steps should be taken if not?
So, yeah, I think you're going to see a number of policies. And I think, again, one of the really interesting things coming out of, or hopefully coming out of this, COVID time, is that you're seeing that a lot of the policy intervention in terms of stimulus efforts and propping up economies around the world has been focused around, whether it be electrification, clean energy development, and I think all of that has had a massively positive impact. Now, again, this year you've started to see, with, like you say, the new US administration are making some more comments about supply chain security and what they're looking to do from a policy perspective there. So there's a lot happening in the policy arena, and it's really, I think, what's important is you need the policy and industry, right? And it's bringing those two forces together which really accelerate the industry as a whole. And I think we certainly have the industry, stepping up. We've seen that through the tens of billions of dollars that have been sort of committed over the past few years, and having that added incentive and added push from a policy perspective is going to just accelerate the effort. So I think, again, a lot more. We hear this from, countries, whether it be in North America, whether it be various economies in Europe. Governments are looking really strongly at one, how can we move towards, a more clean energy future and the energy transition and what can be done at that point. But it doesn't take very long of digging into that topic to realize that you also need policy to support the supply chain for that type of development. So, yeah, I think, like I say, bringing policy and industry, those two forces together, you've seen what that can do in China, and it cemented China as sort of the leader of this growth for a generation. And now it's time to see that type of growth and that type of development in North America, Europe, and other parts of the world.
Right. And in terms of batteries, do you think North America could actually take a bigger share of this space? And if you could actually briefly explain to the people that are watching today how we got to a situation where Asia is leading.
Yeah, so, well, I suppose, the way the situation has developed over time is it really was, your major battery incumbents were developed, they were nurtured in the Asian markets, not necessarily China to begin with. It was the likes of your Panasonics, your Samsungs, your LG Chem, so Japan, Korea-based sort of companies that really led the commercialization of lithium-ion technologies. And that was, of course, initially in your portable electronics. And now we're looking at this major growth driver being electric vehicles. But China then followed in suit, and China, certainly from a supply chain perspective, invested most aggressively across the supply chain. So it wasn't just building out its battery raw material or its battery production capabilities, it was building out the raw material supply chains for that lithium-ion economy. So, what needs to be done, I think, that there's a lot of lessons that you can take. And I say quite a lot recently to people that, rather than looking at China as a risk of this whole thing, which, from some countries' perspective it is, but I think you have to look at China as the blueprint of what can actually be achieved. And to really develop the lithium-ion economy in other parts of the world, and to compete with China, it is about having that full perspective of the whole supply chain. And it's not just having, a dominance over one section of the supply chain, because as I think, North American and European producers are coming to learn, particularly the automotive companies, they're looking at this and going, well, maybe we can just invest in battery production, and that solves one of your problems, but it doesn't really solve your problems if everything else is still coming from other parts of the world and you're still heavily dependent on everywhere else to really feed into that. So, the build out the lithium-ion economy, as we like to call it, has many faces, and a lot's going to have to be done, and a lot of different disciplines, right? This can't be just, I think the key to really developing this is not taking it as just one thing. Developing a mining infrastructure to support these type of markets is very different from having the sort of technology base and skill set that you need further downstream. So there isn't any one size fits all, I think, for countries to sort of look at, but you have to look at where there are competitive advantages in certain regions and how they can leverage those advantages in the same way that China has. China doesn't have the whole supply chain, but where it doesn't have it, it's invested very strategically to secure it. And I think, like I say, that's a blueprint for anywhere else in the world that wants to play a role in this.
Right, and we've talked about raw materials, batteries. I'm actually interested to talk about the midstream, and in particular cathodes and anodes. Just wanted to ask you, what trends have you seen in that sector of the supply chain in the last year, and what challenges are ahead for that part of the supply chain?
Yeah, so I think a couple of trends really. In terms of the expansions, we've continued to see that China, has really led the way. And although you're starting to see, particularly on the cathode side, you're starting to see some really interesting partnerships and investments go into developing cathode production capabilities elsewhere in the world. But those just aren't happening at the rate that they're happening in China. So, if you look at this from a market share point of view, China's market share is still growing when you look forward and you look at where the capacity is being installed. Now, that in itself isn't a negative thing. If that's where all the battery production is going to happen over the sort of next 5 years, then that makes quite, perfect sense. But I think, as we're talking about the emergence of battery production capabilities in Europe, North America, and other countries that we've talked about, really means that you need that next step up the supply chain. And I think not just from a scale point of view, but there's a real opportunity here. And what I think is interesting with some of the partnerships you're seeing is it doesn't necessarily have to be the biggest cathode production capability, but you can leverage quality, you can leverage new technology. And that's constantly what the battery industry is going to be running to keep up with, right? As all the demands in energy density and performance and life cycle of these batteries, and where you can cement new technologies, where you can develop partnerships which allow you to commercialize those technologies quicker, is a massive opportunity, I think, for other parts of the world to really take a significant stake in this market, if not at the scale of China. Focusing on some of the technology and quality of the cathode and anode that you can provide, which ultimately for Western automakers is going to be a huge benefit and a huge attraction when you look at what the battery can do, bringing your cost down per kilowatt hour and being competitive in this new EV landscape.
Right. And one topic that continues to come up, and it's really important for the entire industry, is ESG, which I know you also look at Benchmark. How have you seen this topic evolve in the last year, maybe from a concept that is constantly being discussed to actually impacting decisions in the industry?
Yeah, well, and I think going back to the discussion about capital coming into the market, and I think what's very different now compared to when you look at that previous influx of capital around the price spike 2016, 2017 is the renewed focus or the new focus in some ways on these ESG criteria. It's not that they've been completely off the radar and investors weren't thinking about that at that point in time. But I think when you look at where there's sort of capital flows are going, and when you look at where development is really being made, or projects which look increasingly attractive to investors, are some of those that have more stringent ESG criteria, or that can demonstrate that they can sustainably supply this raw material. Because I think there's an understanding, not just from investors, but from all actors in the supply chain, that you want to keep these clean energy supply chains clean, and you want to be able to have reputable brands, and you want to be able to trace your material and have some security and limit your risk from an ESG perspective. So it's an added advantage to those companies that can demonstrate that. We've been doing a huge amount of work at Benchmark and trying to provide the industry, and I think one aspect is being able to plot all of these different types of companies in a uniform way, so that people, external stakeholders, can look at the industry and see how different companies sort of stack up at each layer of the supply chain. And that's where we focus a huge amount of our research. But I think that's off the back of the increased demand we've seen from, like I say, stakeholders from across the supply chain, and being able to identify where is that risk. And before the money comes in, there's definitely additional questions that are being asked to meet certain criteria. So I think that's the big change that we've seen from the last price spike, and that's really intensified over the past 12 months, and I don't see that going away anytime soon.
All right, my last question for you, Andy, is about, you are hosting the EV Fest for a second year. Could you just tell the people that are watching today why they should attend and what can they expect at the event?
Yeah, so EV Fest is something we developed last year, in response to, I suppose, not being able to do our in-person events, but it morphed into such a huge, all-encompassing battery supply chain bonanza that we had events spread over the course of a week, free seminars that anyone can register for on our website, benchmarkminerals.com. You can see the full agenda for EV Fest, and basically each day has 4 to 5 different sessions focused on different aspects of the supply chain. And what we try and do is provide not just some of our own independent perspective on those markets, but we have keynote speakers and we have companies as well presenting how they fit into those supply chains. So anyone looking at the space, I'd really encourage you to sign up. As I say, it's free to register for the events. So go to our website, sign up, and you can see the full agenda, which runs from the 1st to the 4th of June, I believe. Those days might be slightly wrong, but it's definitely the first week of June. So yeah, go on our website and you can see all the details there.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Priscilla. Good speaking to you.